The sound of sobbing echoed through the trauma bay at St. Mary's Medical Center, but it wasn't coming from any of the patients. For the third time that week, Nurse Rachel Torres stood in the supply closet, tears streaming down her face, her small frame shaking as she tried to compose herself after witnessing another brutal car accident victim brought through the doors. The medical staff had watched her break down so many times they'd started taking bets on how long she'd last before transferring to a gentler department like dermatology. But when 4 Navy helicopters descended on the hospital parking lot like mechanical thunder, and a team of special operations forces stormed through the emergency doors demanding "Storm Angel," everyone realized they had been catastrophically wrong about the woman they'd dismissed as too weak for trauma medicine. Before we dive into this incredible story, I want to ask, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your location in the comments below, and make sure to hit that subscribe button if you love stories about hidden heroes who prove that strength comes in forms we never expect. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Trauma Department cast their harsh, unforgiving glow over everything, turning the sterile white walls into a stark reminder of life and death decisions made every hour of every day. In this unforgiving environment, Rachel Torres had become the subject of whispered conversations and barely concealed mockery from her colleagues. She was 29 years old, though her youthful face and small stature made her look closer to 22. Her dark brown hair was always pulled back in a tight ponytail, revealing features that were delicate and expressive, perhaps too expressive for the brutal realities of emergency medicine. Rachel stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, and her scrubs seemed to hang on her petite frame like clothes borrowed from a larger sister. "There she goes again," whispered Dr. Marcus Steinberg, the trauma department's head surgeon, as he watched Rachel hurry past with her head down, clearly fighting back tears after assisting with a motorcycle accident victim. Steinberg was a man in his mid-50s with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that made medical students quake in their white coats. He had built his reputation on being tough, uncompromising, and absolutely intolerant of what he perceived as weakness. "I give her 2 more weeks," replied Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the ambitious resident who had been vying for a permanent position in trauma surgery. Walsh was everything Rachel wasn't: tall, confident, and possessed of the kind of emotional armor that allowed her to crack chest cavities. She cried during that appendectomy yesterday. An appendectomy! If she can't handle routine surgery without waterworks, how is she supposed to function during a real emergency? Rachel heard every word as she passed by the nurses' station, her cheeks burning with shame and frustration. She had been working in the trauma department for 4 months, and in that time she had earned a reputation as the nurse who couldn't handle the tough cases. Every time a particularly brutal injury came through the doors, every time they had to pronounce someone dead despite their best efforts, Rachel found herself overwhelmed with emotion. What none of them knew, what Rachel had spent years trying to forget, was that her tears weren't a sign of weakness. They were the opposite. In her previous life, she had seen so much death, so much senseless violence, that she had learned to shut down completely, to become a machine that could function in the most horrific circumstances without feeling anything at all. The tears were actually a sign that she was healing, that she was becoming human again after years of being a weapon. But she couldn't tell them that. She couldn't explain that the woman they mocked for being too sensitive had once performed emergency surgery on a wounded Marine while insurgent mortars exploded around her position. She couldn't tell them that Hospital Corpsman First Class Rachel Torres, call sign Storm Angel, had been one of the most decorated combat medics in recent military history, before a classified incident in Syria had ended her career and left her with PTSD that manifested as overwhelming empathy instead of emotional shutdown. "Torres!" Dr. Steinberg's voice cut through her memories like a scalpel. Stop standing around feeling sorry for yourself and get over here. We have a trauma coming in, and I need every available hand, even yours." Rachel straightened her shoulders and hurried over to the trauma bay, where the rest of the team was preparing for an incoming ambulance. The paramedics had radioed ahead with preliminary information. Multiple gunshot wounds, critical condition, ETA, 2 minutes. "Torres, I want you on observation only," Dr. Steinberg commanded as he pulled on sterile gloves. "No direct patient contact. The last thing I need is you having another emotional breakdown in the middle of a critical case." The words stung, but Rachel nodded and positioned herself against the far wall of the trauma bay. She had learned to make herself as small and invisible as possible during these situations, staying out of the way while the real medical professionals did their work. The automatic doors burst open with their familiar hiss, and the paramedics rushed in, pushing a gurney that carried what looked more like a war casualty than a typical emergency room patient. The victim was a young man, probably in his early 20s, wearing what appeared to be military fatigues. His chest and abdomen were soaked with blood, and his breathing was labored and irregular. Male, approximately 22, multiple GSWs to the torso. The lead paramedic, a veteran named Carlos Rodriguez, called out as they transferred the patient to the trauma bed. "Lost vitals twice en route, but we got him back. BP is 60/40 and dropping fast." Rachel's trained eye immediately assessed the patient's condition from her position against the wall. She could see the way his chest rose unevenly, suggesting at least one collapsed lung. The pattern of blood on his uniform indicated damage to multiple organs, and the gray pallor of his skin told her that he was in severe hypovolemic shock. Dr. Steinberg stepped up to the bedside, his demeanor shifting into the controlled urgency that had made him famous in trauma surgery circles. "Let's get 2 large-bore IVs going and start pushing fluids. Walsh, I want a chest x-ray and a full trauma panel. Someone call the blood bank and tell them we're going to need at least 8 units of O negative." As the team worked around the patient, Rachel found herself studying the young man's face. There was something familiar about him, something that nagged at the edges of her memory. When she saw the small tattoo on his wrist, a trident surrounded by an eagle, her blood ran cold. Navy SEAL. The insignia was subtle, barely visible beneath the blood and medical equipment, but Rachel recognized it instantly. This wasn't just any trauma victim. This was one of the elite warriors she had once served alongside in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. "His pressure is crashing," Dr. Walsh called out, her voice tight with controlled panic. "We need to get him to surgery, now!" "Not yet," Dr. Steinberg replied, his hands working to insert a chest tube. "I need to stabilize him first. Torres, stop gawking and make yourself useful. Go prep OR2 for emergency surgery." Rachel started to move toward the door, but something made her stop. She looked at the patient again, and this time she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. The way he was positioned, the angle of his head, the slight deviation of his trachea. These were signs she had seen before in combat zones. "Doctor," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the noise of the trauma team. "I think he might have a tension pneumothorax on the right side." Dr. Steinberg looked up from his work, his face flushed with concentration and annoyance. "What did you just say?" "The trachea is deviated slightly to the left," Rachel continued, her voice growing stronger despite her trembling hands. "And if you look at his jugular veins, they're distended." "I think the chest tube placement might be." "Are you seriously trying to diagnose my patient?" Dr. Steinberg's voice rose dangerously. "You're a nurse, Torres, a barely competent nurse who can't even handle routine procedures without crying. I don't need medical advice from someone who should probably be working in a gift shop." The words hit Rachel like physical blows, and she felt the familiar burn of tears starting to form in her eyes. But this time, something was different. This time, she was looking at a Navy SEAL, one of her own, dying on a table while an arrogant surgeon ignored critical warning signs. "Doctor, please," she said, her voice cracking with emotion, but carrying an undertone of authority that surprised everyone in the room. "I've seen this before. If you don't decompress that right side immediately, he's going to code." "Get out," Dr. Steinberg said flatly. "Get out of my trauma bay right now, before I have security escort you out of the building." Rachel looked around the room at the faces of her colleagues, some pitying, some annoyed, all of them convinced that she was having another emotional breakdown. She started to back toward the door, but then the patient's monitor began to alarm. His oxygen saturation was dropping rapidly, his blood pressure was barely registering, and Rachel could see the telltale signs of cardiovascular collapse that she had witnessed too many times in field hospitals across 3 different combat zones. The young SEAL was dying, and she was the only person in the room who recognized the signs. That's when Rachel Torres made the decision that would change everything. She stepped forward, pushing past Dr. Walsh and reaching for a large-bore needle from the emergency kit. "What are you doing?" Dr. Steinberg shouted, but Rachel was no longer listening. With movements that were suddenly fluid and precise, movements that belonged to Storm Angel, not the crying nurse everyone thought they knew, Rachel positioned the needle at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and drove it deep into the patient's chest. The sound of escaping air was audible throughout the trauma bay, a long, hissing release of pressure that had been slowly crushing the young man's heart and lungs. Almost immediately, his oxygen saturation began to climb, and his color started to return to normal. The room fell completely silent, except for the steady beeping of monitors that were now showing vastly improved vital signs. Rachel stepped back, her hands beginning to shake again now that the immediate crisis had passed. She looked around at the stunned faces of the medical team, all of whom were staring at her as if she had just performed a miracle. "How did you—" Dr. Steinberg began, but his question was interrupted by a sound that made everyone in the hospital freeze. It started as a low rumble that seemed to come from deep underground, vibrating through the building's steel and concrete structure. Then it grew louder, more distinct, until the unmistakable sound of rotors filled the air outside the trauma bay windows. But this wasn't the familiar whine of medical helicopters or news choppers. This was something heavier, more powerful, more ominous. The sound of military aircraft approaching fast and with serious intent. Through the windows they could see lights cutting through the darkness, not the red and white of civilian aircraft, but the subdued colors of military hardware. 4 sets of lights, flying in tight formation, approaching the hospital with the kind of precision that spoke of combat-trained pilots and urgent missions. "What the hell is that?" Dr. Walsh whispered, pressing her face against the window as the sound grew overwhelming. Rachel knew that sound. She knew it in her bones, in the deepest parts of her memory that she had tried so hard to suppress. Those were MH-60 Seahawks, the Navy's version of the Black Hawk helicopter, and they weren't here for a routine medical evacuation. The first helicopter landed in the hospital parking lot with a precision that sent cars scattering and set off every alarm in the vicinity. The second, third, and fourth followed in rapid succession, their rotors still spinning as armed figures began pouring out of the aircraft. Dr. Steinberg was shouting orders, trying to maintain control of his department as the noise outside became deafening. Patients in the waiting room were crying out in fear. Nurses were trying to calm them, and security guards were frantically calling for backup. But Rachel was backing away from the trauma bed, her face pale, with a fear that had nothing to do with the medical emergency they had just handled. She knew why those helicopters were here. She knew what they represented. And she knew that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to come crashing down around her. The emergency department doors didn't just open. They exploded inward as if hit by a battering ram. 6 figures in full naval combat gear stormed into the hospital, their movements coordinated with the lethal precision of a special operations unit. They wore dark blue uniforms with no visible unit patches, their faces hidden behind tactical helmets and night vision equipment. The lead figure, a man who radiated command authority even with his face concealed, stepped into the trauma bay and surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had been in countless high-stress situations. "This facility is now under temporary military jurisdiction," the man announced, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I am Commander Jake Morrison, United States Navy Special Operations Command. All personnel will remain calm and comply with our instructions." Dr. Steinberg stepped forward, his medical ego clashing directly with military protocol. "Commander, I don't know what kind of exercise this is supposed to be, but this is a civilian hospital. You can't just storm in here with weapons and—" "Doctor," Commander Morrison interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I am not here to discuss jurisdictional issues. I am here to retrieve a critical asset that we have reason to believe is currently employed at this facility." He pulled out a tablet device and activated it, showing a photograph that made Rachel's stomach drop to her feet. It was her own image, but not as she appeared now. This was Rachel Torres from 5 years ago, in military dress blues, standing at attention with a chest full of commendations and the confident bearing of a combat veteran. "We are looking for former Hospital Corpsman First Class Rachel Torres, service number 4429-7831-5594. Call sign Storm Angel," Morrison announced to the stunned medical staff. "Intelligence indicates that she is currently working as a registered nurse at this facility." The trauma bay erupted in shocked murmurs and incredulous whispers. Every eye turned to Rachel, who stood frozen against the back wall, looking like a deer caught in headlights. Dr. Steinberg looked from the photograph to Rachel and back again, his mind struggling to reconcile the crying, incompetent nurse he thought he knew with the decorated military hero staring back at him from the tablet screen. "There's been some mistake," Dr. Steinberg said slowly. "Torres is just a nurse. She's not even a particularly good one. She breaks down crying at the sight of blood." Commander Morrison's expression hardened behind his tactical gear. "Doctor, the woman you're describing just performed a needle thoracostomy that saved the life of one of our most valuable assets. That procedure, executed under pressure with perfect technique, is consistent with the combat medical training that earned Storm Angel her reputation as one of the finest field medics in naval history." He turned his attention directly to Rachel. "Hospital Corpsman Torres, we have a situation that requires your immediate expertise. A classified military operation has gone wrong, and we have multiple casualties trapped in a hostile environment. The mission commander specifically requested you by name and call sign." Rachel found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Commander, I've been discharged from active duty for 3 years. I'm not qualified for—" "Torres," Morrison cut her off. 12 hours ago, a Navy SEAL team conducting a training exercise in the Olympic National Forest was attacked by unknown hostiles. We have 7 wounded operators, 3 of them critical, trapped in terrain too dangerous for standard medevac operations. They're refusing treatment from anyone except Storm Angel. They say you're the only medic they trust to get them out alive." The weight of his words settled over the trauma bay like a heavy blanket. Rachel looked at the patient on the bed, the young SEAL whose life she had just saved, and realized that he was probably connected to the team trapped in the mountains. "How many casualties?" she heard herself ask, her voice suddenly steady and professional. 7 confirmed wounded, condition unknown due to communication difficulties. Hostile forces are still active in the area, which means we'll be inserting you directly into a combat zone. Rachel felt something shifting inside her, something that had been dormant for years suddenly awakening. The tears that had defined her civilian identity dried up completely, replaced by the cool, analytical mindset that had carried her through the worst combat zones of the Middle East. Dr. Steinberg stepped between Rachel and the commander. "Wait just a minute. You can't just take one of my nurses off on some military operation. I don't care what she used to be. Right now, she's a civilian employee of this hospital, and she's clearly not qualified for combat medicine." Commander Morrison looked at Dr. Steinberg with the kind of cold stare that had intimidated enemy combatants in a dozen different countries. "Doctor, with all due respect, the woman you just told me isn't qualified for combat medicine, has more combat medical experience than your entire trauma team combined. Storm Angel performed surgery under fire in 3 different theaters of operation. She holds the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat, and her techniques are still taught at the Naval Hospital Corps School." He turned back to Rachel. "The choice is yours, Torres. But I need to know right now, are you still Storm Angel, or are you just Rachel the nurse?" Rachel looked around the trauma bay one more time. She saw Dr. Steinberg's shocked expression, Dr. Walsh's incredulous stare, and the faces of all the colleagues who had mocked her and dismissed her for months. Then she looked at the patient on the trauma bed, a young SEAL who was alive because she had trusted her instincts and acted when it mattered most. For the first time in 3 years, Rachel Torres straightened to her full height and looked Commander Morrison directly in the eye. "Storm Angel, reporting for duty, sir."
When do we leave?
The transformation was so complete, so dramatic, that the medical staff could only watch in stunned silence. The crying, incompetent nurse they thought they knew had vanished, replaced by a confident military professional who radiated competence and authority. Morrison nodded with satisfaction. "Outstanding. We have a full combat medical kit prepared, and the insertion aircraft is standing by. Fair warning, Torres. This is going to be dangerous. The hostiles who attacked our people are well-armed and highly motivated." Rachel was already moving toward the exit, her civilian persona completely abandoned. "Commander, I didn't earn the call sign Storm Angel by playing it safe. Let's go get our people." As they headed for the door, Dr. Steinberg called out behind them. "Torres! Rachel! You can't just walk out in the middle of your shift.
If you leave now, don't bother coming back."
Rachel paused at the doorway and turned back to face the man who had spent months humiliating her and questioning her competence. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet authority that made everyone in the trauma bay listen. "Dr. Steinberg, the patient in bed 1 has a slow internal bleed that your trauma panel missed. His hemoglobin is going to drop significantly over the next 4 hours. Get him to surgery before his pressure crashes, or you'll lose him." She paused, letting that sink in, then continued. "The young lady in bed 3 has a basilar skull fracture, not just a concussion like you diagnosed. Watch for cerebrospinal fluid from her ear. If you see it, she needs immediate neurosurgical intervention." Dr. Steinberg's face went pale as he realized that Rachel had been observing and analyzing every case with the eye of a combat-trained medical expert, even while they treated her like an incompetent amateur. "And doctor," Rachel added as she followed Morrison toward the exit, "the next time you have a nurse who cries when she sees suffering, consider the possibility that she's not too weak for medicine. She's too human for war. But when war comes to her, she'll do whatever it takes to save lives." The roar of helicopter rotors grew overwhelming as they stepped outside into the artificial hurricane created by 4 military aircraft. Rachel could see the tactical teams preparing for what was obviously going to be a dangerous rescue mission, loading equipment and checking weapons.
As she walked toward the lead helicopter, Rachel felt the last vestiges of her civilian identity falling away like a discarded costume. The tears were gone, replaced by the cold focus that had carried her through the worst combat zones on Earth. Her hands were steady, her mind was clear, and she was exactly where she belonged, preparing to risk her life to save the lives of warriors who had called for her by name. Behind her, the trauma bay of St. Mary's Medical Center continued its work, but the conversations would never be the same. The staff who had mocked Rachel Torres for being too weak, too emotional, too incompetent for emergency medicine, were left to contemplate the uncomfortable truth that they had failed to recognize a genuine hero when she stood among them. Dr. Steinberg stood at the window, watching the helicopters disappear into the night sky, carrying away the woman he had dismissed as a liability. In his hand, he held Rachel's hospital ID badge, which she had dropped in her transformation from crying nurse to combat medic. The photograph on the badge showed the same face, the same gentle features, the same compassionate eyes. But now he could see what he had missed before: the quiet strength, the depth of experience, the eyes that had seen combat and saved lives under conditions he couldn't even imagine. 60 miles away, in a heavily forested ravine where 7 wounded Navy SEALs lay trapped by hostile fire, the sound of approaching helicopters was like the voice of salvation cutting through the darkness. The wounded men looked up through their pain and exhaustion as the Seahawks appeared over the tree line, and one of them, a young petty officer with shrapnel wounds across his chest, managed a weak smile. "You hear that?" he whispered to his team leader, a grizzled chief petty officer whose leg was broken in 3 places. "That's Storm Angel coming for us." The chief nodded, his breathing labored but his voice strong. "Storm Angel doesn't leave anyone behind. Never has. Never will." As the helicopters descended toward the combat zone, the SEALs knew that their call for help had been answered. The crying nurse from the civilian hospital was gone, replaced by the warrior they needed, the one they had always needed, even when the world couldn't see past her tears to the unbreakable core of strength beneath. Rachel Torres was coming home, and she was bringing everything she had learned about saving lives in the most impossible circumstances. The tears that had defined her civilian life were gone, but the compassion that drove them remained, transformed into the focused determination that had made Storm Angel a legend among the men and women who fight America's most dangerous battles. In the end, the greatest heroes are often the ones we fail to recognize, hidden behind facades that fool us into thinking we understand their true nature. Rachel Torres had been both the crying nurse and Storm Angel all along. The difference was simply a matter of what the situation required, and whether anyone was wise enough to look beyond the surface to see the warrior within.